like the dominant culture, partly because there's such a fear, and it's a fear that's been reproduced in the media about that somehow the recognition of the constitutional recognition of indigenous rights will end up hurting the Bengalis of Bangladesh. And we have to actually address that fear, and we have to put that, we have to address that fear through doing historical research, talking about the nature of the boundaries and the accidental nature and the rights indigenous peoples had under British rule and under Pakistani rule, and how that's shifted. But that seems very important. But also, I think it's very important to acknowledge that as long as only some groups are excluded from full citizenship rights, including the right to security and livelihood, the majority of us will have privileges rather than rights, and our privileges will be very tenuous, and they'll need to be constantly secured because they are so tenuous. And again, in this context, it's very important for us to understand the relationship between cultural rights and political economy. They're deeply entangled. I would say that we need to understand and rethink what we mean by nationalism, and to think of nationalism not just as something exclusionary, so that we think of a different way would be to think of a just nationalism, one that wouldn't mean that when somebody asks for their rights, they're construed as anti-national. But that also really depends on rethinking things like the distribution of resources and the production of inequality, and how much the current status quo depends upon generating anxiety about identity and anxiety about belonging in the nation state. So, thank you.